Yeah, I'm habitually quite a rule follower, so it was quite a surprise to find myself sitting in the road with the police approaching me, ready to arrest me. So maybe, well, I will say something about how I got there. And it's quite a good hook to hang a talk off. And for me, it was quite a novel experience, so it stands out. But of course, I wasn't there for a novel experience or for a good hook for a talk, although that often is something that I'm thinking about when I find myself, usually when I find myself embarrassing myself, I think, well, at least I can use this in a Dharma talk later on. I was there because I'd come to understand the very seriousness of the climate and ecological emergency. I'm going to read a few facts out in a moment. I think actually the moment when the level of seriousness kind of dropped into my gut was probably a couple of years ago when I was putting together a handbook for Buddhist Action Month, and I was researching the climate crisis to write the introduction for the handbook that I was writing. And the more and more research that I did, the worse and worse I felt. It triggered a grief in me for the loss that has already happened and a fear of the loss that is to come. So I'm going to read a few facts out and just notice how they land with you, if there's any emotional response, if there's any physical response as I'm doing that. That's the invitation. And the sources for these are all on the Extinction Rebellion website. And many of these will be known, but it seemed important to start from this place. So, carbon dioxide levels are higher than at any point in the last 3 million years. 20 of the hottest years on record have been in the last 22 years. I suspect that ratio will change for the worse this year and year on year. Melting ice caps because of the temperature rising means sea level rises and more extreme weather. When I was leaving to come to Buddhafield on Thursday afternoon, the news was full of the flooding in Germany in which 42 people lost their lives. That kind of extreme weather event becomes more and more likely. And it shows us that we are already in the crisis. It isn't something that's in the future. Heat waves, drought, floods and so on have doubled since the early 1990s. Of course, as we're sitting here enjoying the festival, there are forest fires raging through California. Air pollution causes 4.8 million deaths per year, and some people think 24 deaths per day in London. Wildlife populations have declined by nearly 70% since the 1970s. Some scientists suggest that by 2050, 99% of coral reefs will have died. And the IPCC say that carbon dioxide must decline by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, and that we should be at net zero by 2050 for a 50% chance of keeping the global average temperature rise at 1.5 degrees. So even if we take urgent action and do everything we need to do, it's a 50% chance that we will keep to that 1.5 degrees, which doesn't sound like very much. But beyond that, there's a potential cascade of effects leading to more and more catastrophic consequences. And if nothing changes, we're on track for 3 or 4 degrees of warming. At 4 degrees, large portions of the planet will be too hot to live on. And the planet would struggle to sustain even half of the current population. So let's just pause for a moment and notice how we receive that. Maybe you didn't hear half the words. Sometimes when I'm reading, as we heard in a talk earlier, you know, the thing we can't take, it's too difficult to take in. Maybe some of it has landed and is affecting you. I'm really lucky and grateful to be sustained by a Buddhist practice that allows my heart to be open enough sometimes that I can receive this and hold the amount of grief and despair and anger that sometimes is triggered when I'm coming into relationship with these facts and figures. And it was noticing how strong a reaction there was in myself, how urgent the climate and ecological crisis is, that led me to the possibility of civil disobedience. I've been engaged in many different ways for many years, but the idea of breaking a rule, oh my goodness, that was almost too much to contemplate. Luckily, doing it in a group is much easier. The day before I was meditating in the road and got arrested, I was part of an opening ceremony that faith groups organised near Waterloo, near a church in Waterloo. And I was invited to speak for a few minutes. And this story about the Buddha came so clearly into my mind and seemed exactly the appropriate thing to share. And since then, I've never been able to find a reference for it. I don't know if it's true or not. I can't remember where I heard it from. And I've been here for a few days. I keep thinking, oh, next time you see Devan, just ask if he recognises this story. And yet, I haven't managed to do that. Whether it's canonical or not, it was inspiring to me. And it suggested a mode of activism that I could get my head around. So the story is that two of these kingdoms that the Buddha travelled through regularly had come into some conflict. And the one had decided to attack the other. And the Buddha went to try and talk them out of this. He gave them lots of good, wise advice. But they were resolute in their determination to go to war effectively. And seeing this conviction and anticipating how inevitable this conflict was, and knowing where the battle would take place, the Buddha found somewhere to sit and meditate near the conflict so that he could be seen doing this practice. And so I don't know whether it was for the purpose of bearing witness. That's how I take the story. And so that he could bear witness to the suffering that was about to be created. And for me, that idea of taking your practice to that place and modelling a different way of being in the midst of that was really powerful. Also, the idea of bearing witness is really powerful. Bernie Glassman talks about the three tenets of something. There's a particular name for them, but one is bearing witness, one is not knowing, and one is maybe taking action. This is where I'm grateful that I wrote some things down. I didn't write that down. But it's the idea that actually, in order to respond to something, you have to meet it and be intimate with it. And there's something really important for me about practice supporting witnessing. So I had that story in the back of my mind on this Tuesday morning, the next day. And we'd marched down in various groups from different places and congregated in Parliament Square, and there were vans full of police, there were lines of police in high-vis jackets. The atmosphere was bright, it was like a carnival, the weather was good, there were lots of flags, the samba band was playing, people were handing out food, there was lots of lively conversations. And at some point, one of the marches sat down in the road in George Street, which is kind of isn't the road that runs in front of the House of Parliament, but it's the perpendicular, it's the T-junction. And slowly a few of us went and sat in the road, and then we noticed that there's this row of police in high-vis uniforms, arm to arm with no gaps in between them, making sure that we can't go any further into the road and cause any more disruption. And then there's a big banner and all the rebels are behind the banner. And there's about 5 or 6 meters of clear space in between these two things. And the anticipation is the police will move forward. Any free space they can take to free it up to cause less disruption. So someone said, let's go and sit in that place. So about 4 or 5 of us went. Some people had got meditation stools, some had got cushions. I rolled up my backpack with my coat in and sat down in a slightly awkward position and started meditating on the tarmac in the middle of a busy city centre in front of a line of police. I had my robes on that day, I was still ordained, and I've never been photographed so many times in my life as sitting there in a meditation posture. And something felt intuitively right about that. I didn't have a strategy of, oh, this is the right place to cause disruption, or this is going to be the most effective use of my time. It was more a gut feeling or a heart feeling that led me into that place. I'm not sure I can even explain it now, but it felt profoundly important to be sitting in the road and creating that disruption and not to allow the police to move us on. As I'm sitting here now, actually, I wonder if partly it was because it was my first experience of that kind of action and I wanted to get it right. So there was probably some of that going on. I want to do a good job here. And also a knowing that, oh, this is what we've come here to do. We've come here to raise the alarm, and to do that by creating disruption, by stopping traffic, by forcing people to go the other way, by making some noise. If we do this completely peacefully and without any disturbance, probably it won't get reported in the press. This was kind of part of my understanding of why civil disobedience was so important, is because people have been campaigning in other ways for many years and to some good result, but not enough and not quickly enough. And what I saw during the previous rebellion, which I wasn't a part of, was that this kind of level of disruption created stories in the news, and suddenly people were talking about the climate crisis and the news were reporting about the climate crisis in a way that hadn't been happening previously. If I owned a newspaper, if I was a billionaire that owned a newspaper, I could just print the stories that I wanted to print. Or maybe I could buy lunch with the government. Or fund my own election campaign. But I don't have the resources or the capacity to do that kind of lobbying. So it's a way of correcting that power imbalance. To make enough noise that somebody has to notice you. Is it Buddhist to meditate in the road? I wondered. It's tempting when that question is asked, and I've done this previously when trying to kind of justify any kind of social engagement, to look back through the Buddha's life and say, well, the Buddha did this thing or that thing or that thing, but there aren't really many examples of the Buddha being socially engaged. There are certain things that he did that suggest he wanted a fair society, for example. But his main role was as a spiritual mentor and a guide and the creator of a community. He would give advice to kings, but he didn't take all the monks out and sit in the road until the kings took that advice. So I probably couldn't justify what I was doing that way by examining the autobiography of the Buddha, biography. David Loy reminded me of a Zen koan that I find really helpful, which is, I think I wrote down the names of the people in the interaction. So a koan is like usually a little interaction between a master and a disciple. Usually from years and years ago, that is given to a student in the present to teach them something. A little encapsulation of the Dharma that happens in this encounter when two people meet. A monk asked Yunmen, "What are the teachings of a whole lifetime?" And the master replied, "An appropriate response." And I really like this because it suggests to me that my job is to find an appropriate response to the conditions that I find myself in, not to copy the response that the Buddha might have made 2,500 years ago, when he was in very different conditions. So being moved by the climate and ecological emergency and by that grief and frustration and anger that I spoke about, folding that into my meditation practice and into my chanting practice, it becomes an urgency to act. For me, that's the appropriate response. For me, with my Dharma practice, with the things I know, this was the appropriate response in that time and that place. And as I was preparing for this talk, another little Zen koan came to mind. Yun Yun asked Dawu, I'm probably completely mangling the pronunciation of these names, so apologies. How does Kuan Yin use all those hands and eyes? Kuan Yin's the Chinese name for Avalokiteshvara. here they are on the tanker hanging with 10,000 eye hands, each with an eye in them, so they can respond compassionately to whatever they find. And the question is, how do they use all those hands and eyes? So you could say, how do you actually be compassionate? How do you change that feeling into action? What does compassion look like? And the answer was, like someone in the night reaching behind their head to adjust their pillow. I didn't bring a pillow with me to Butterfield. I've just got my jumper rolled up and under my head, so I'm reaching around a lot to adjust it in the night. And mostly I'm doing that while I'm half asleep. And I think this is, for me, this is the meaning of this. It's something that happens instinctively, without thinking. It's a response to a little irritation, and you make a little adjustment, and suddenly it's easier to sleep. We don't need to make a big song and dance about it. We don't need to calculate exactly the right sort of pillow. We don't need to go and get somebody else to help. It's just, and it's done. And so for me, there's something of that quality of instinct was around. Oh, here's the situation I'm in. Here are all the facts that I know. I can't necessarily, I can't put them all on a board with lots of pins and pieces of string and then make sense of them and work it out using my brain. What is the exact right thing that's going to save the world or change the world? But I have some kind of feeling sense, similar to that of just adjusting the pillow in the night. That taking my practice in the street is the right thing to do. A kind of heart connection to this sort of action, I guess. Usually meditation is something we do at home or in retreat centres. And in the past, when I've been engaged in social action or social engagement, I've thought of this movement between practice where I digest my feelings, where I open my heart, where I create spaciousness, where I come back into a place of energy, and then going back out into the world and doing something where I get triggered, where I get exhausted, where things come up. Being in the real world, trying to do something compassionate in the real world is not always easy. And then coming back into retreat or into my practice, allowing those things to settle, making sense of them, learning something, going back out into the world slightly differently, and so on. This cycle of movement between the two things. And what I really appreciate about XR Buddhists, and this was true before I joined, it was created by people before me, and I guess Dance, the Dharma Action Network for the climate emergency, had been doing this kind of action previously as well, is bringing together the practice and the activism in one moment. So walking meditation through the city or sitting in meditation. And sitting in that moment with the police lined up in front of me, with the noise of the samba band behind me, with the noise of a helicopter coming overhead, checking out what we're doing, a police helicopter, with the uncomfortableness of just sitting in an awkward position. Actually, it was one of the most profound meditation experiences I've had. We were sat for about 3 hours, and of course my mind wasn't calm and peaceful through all of that time, and sometimes I was looking around and seeing what was going on. But amazing clarity of mind, amazing peace of mind, a sense of really being aligned, like of all the places in the world that I needed to be, this felt like exactly the right place. Usually, whatever I do, there's some element of ambivalence. I'm only kind of 90% committing to something or half committing to something, and part of me is criticizing that or suggesting that there's a better way of doing things, or all these stories that we tell ourselves. None of that was happening. Every voice in my head was agreeing that this was exactly the right thing to be doing, which felt like a real gift, a real privilege. And my understanding, or my felt sense maybe, is that the historical Buddha or cosmic Buddhas, they don't separate action and practice in the way that I used to. They just act spontaneously. They just make an appropriate response with loving kindness to whatever is happening. They see something and they're moved, and they make the right response for them in that moment. Practice and action, compassion and wisdom, stillness and movement, they all become the same thing in the Buddha. And I had a glimpse of that when I was meditating in the road that day. It's not always like that, of course. There's the usual cycle of thoughts and feelings and irritations that happens as well. But there was something deeply profound about recognizing that, maybe occasionally I can just wholeheartedly make an appropriate, spontaneous response. I guess the Buddhas are doing that all the time, but it's only going to be occasionally for me. Mostly I'm going to still have some ambivalence about things. So I don't know if you can justify this kind of action theologically or historically or academically. Well, you can certainly make arguments for it one way or the other. But for me, I just make sense of it in those terms, in the experiential terms, in my sense, in my kind of heart sense of what it means to be a Buddha, and occasionally what it means to be someone practicing Buddhism. A couple of times through the afternoon there was a whispered message that got passed from one person to the next person to the next person in this row of police, and then somebody another rebel protester would catch my ear and say, they're going to come and arrest us now, they're going to come and get rid of us. And then finally, about 4:00 in the afternoon, they started approaching the protesters and saying to them, we've now put a section 14 on this area, which means you have to leave the area. If you stay here, you're going to be arrested. Are you willing to move to the pavement or not? And one by one, they came along the row. Most people were willing to move. Some people weren't. I found I was getting really angry at this. And I wasn't angry at the fact that we were being arrested particularly. I was angry. I was like, oh my goodness, why am it's Tuesday afternoon, I've taken time off work, I could be on holiday, I'm breaking the rules. Why should I have to be doing this? This doesn't make any sense to me. How outrageous that I feel so deeply moved I have to put myself in the position where in a minute or two I'm going to be arrested. And that's what happened. Next to me, 2 people away. First of all, my friend was taken away. Next to me, my wife was taken away. They always ask you, will you cooperate? And Satya said, no, I'm not going to cooperate. So it wasn't her first time. 4 police come over and they lift her and carry her out of the road. Makes for very good photographs if you're willing to do that. I thought, for me, being arrested is already edgy enough. If they ask me to cooperate, I'm definitely going to cooperate. I can just break one rule at a time. So this guy came over, this police constable came over, and he read me all the spiel, and do you understand? Yes, I understand. But he can see that I'm annoyed, I'm sure. And I said, do you understand why I feel like I have to be doing this? And he said, I'm not going to discuss that with you. And he just keeps repeating this, and in the end I shut up. And his colleague comes over and says, I really don't want to get a bad back. I've got to lift my 2-year-old up when I get home. And I'm like, I've already agreed that I'm going to stand. In my head, I've already agreed that I'm going to stand up and walk. But now, I've no idea if she's saying the truth or not, but I'm definitely going to stand up. So they asked me to stand up. They put handcuffs on me, I think, because he can see how wound up I am at this, in this moment. Like all my mindfulness has gone out the window as soon as he approaches me. And then about 5 minutes, sorry?
So difficult.
It's so, yeah, well, and actually lots of people have much worse experiences than I did. I was treated really well, and I went on to be treated really well compared to many, many people in the UK and around the world. Climate protesters in India, are beaten with sticks and forced off the streets. And in Belgium, they used one of those huge water cannons to clear the streets. So for me, it was difficult. And I also know that there's much other levels of difficulty that I was really grateful not to be experiencing. Yeah, but thank you. And then there was a huge wait then before they put us into the back of the van and took us to Lewisham Police Station, which is a long way away from where we were. It was getting dark by the time we arrived. They took the handcuffs off me quite quickly because he said, you're not going to run away, are you? And I said, no, I'm not going to run away. It's like, okay, fine. I had this idea, I think it was Chittapala mentioned it earlier, that you hear of these stories of people who treat being in a police cell like being on retreat, or even being in jail like being on retreat. Or I'd heard about, Tibetan refugees who'd been held in Chinese prisons and were doing loving kindness practice to the guards. It's like, right, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be in a police cell for a few hours, perfect opportunity to practice. And it was impossible to show it into quite a frozen state. The police cell is it's all waterproofed, so it's easy to hose down, I guess. There's a fluorescent light, there's no natural light. There's a camera, there's a toilet in the corner, and they tell you the camera can't see the toilet. And you think, okay, I guess that's probably true. And they say, if you want a meal, if you want a blanket, if you want some water, just ring the bell and somebody will come. And I sat on the rubberized mattress, looking at that bell for a very long time, and I could not bring myself to push the buzzer, because I guess I just collapsed into this childlike state where I couldn't ask for anything. I'd been a really bad boy. And eventually I was able to do a little bit of practice. I was doing some Kuan Yin recitation and I fell asleep. And then at some hour they wake you up and say your solicitor's on the phone, and then they wake you up again and say you need to take your fingerprints and so on, like completely losing track of time and feeling quite ashamed that I hadn't managed to find that place of mindfulness, again, of spaciousness that I'd found on the road. It had completely deserted me. And despite that, I suppose, able to trust in some long-term process, like, oh, I know this will come back. I know the possibility of this will be available again in the future. Even if I can't hold this now, the cosmic Buddhas are still holding that space. Even if I can't feel any of that presence or find any spaciousness in myself, I just trust that it's there somewhere. In the Avalokiteshvara chapter, in the Kuan Yin chapter of the Lotus Sutra, one of the lines is about there's a whole list of things that Kuan Yin will rescue you from. Men with knives, falling into a pit, getting attacked by bandits. I don't know if getting imprisoned is on that list, but I had this in mind. Oh, Kuan Yin should come and I'm doing the mantra, I'm calling on Kuan Yin, she should appear and save me. And I wasn't expecting that this would, unbolt the doors, but at least that I might get some solace from it. And maybe later on, the next day when I'd been released, I was able to land in that place. And of course, it's impossible to know what my experience would have been if I wasn't doing that mantra recitation when I was in there. Much worse, probably.
So, what is the mantra?
So, the mantra that I was doing is Namo Kuan Yin Bosat. Namo, I take refuge in, or I call out to Kuan Yin, this bodhisattva, and Bosat, bodhisattva. There's different forms, there's different mantras associated with Avalokiteshvara. That's the one that is familiar to me. Yeah, so I guess that just made me reflect a little bit on the ideal and the actual, oh yeah, I'm still a human being, of course I am. Of course this is going to bring stuff up. And all of that can be held in a bigger container of practice. And occasionally the practice and the action will come together and maybe there's a sort of glimpse of that bodhicitta, of that bodhisattva's heart, that allows me to feel completely aligned. And sometimes, of course, it will be that movement back and forth between the two, being triggered, being human, being having strong feelings, and then coming back into practice, into retreat, and digesting them, and having time to digest them. I want to finish with 3 questions. I don't know when I heard these, whether it was part of what led me into that place, or whether I've just heard them since and really like them. It's 3 questions that David Loy asks. What can I offer? Like, what capacity do I have? What skills do I have? What's my experience? What's actually possible for me to offer in response to the climate and ecological emergency, for example? What does the world need? Like, what's really calling for the most attention right now? And the third one is, what tugs at my heartstrings? And I think when we're choosing an appropriate response to call back to that Zen koan, all 3 of those things are really important. What do I have to offer? What does the world need? And what is tugging at my heartstring? If we only tick 2 out of 3 of those, either we're going to be ineffective or we're going to get burnt out. But if we can tick all 3 of them, then we'll find ourselves in a place where we can do more sustainable action. So I guess that's what I invite you to take away with you. What can I offer? What does the world need? What tugs at my heartstrings?